Today we're going to be discussing Kitnios. So midoraisa, a person can eat chametz, and we had our separate a different discussion about that, which foods are chametz, etc. But today we're going to be talking about the long-standing Ashkenazi minhag not to eat certain foods that we sort of wrap together and call them by the term Kitnios. The Mishnah Berurah gives 3 different reasons why this custom developed. The first is that Kitnios are harvested and processed in ways that are very similar to chametz, and a second reason is that they're ground into flour and baked just like chametz. Those are sort of similar, those reasons. And according to these 2 reasons, the issue is that if a person eat Kitnios, then it might make other people think that, oh, that was really chametz. It's sort of, they're so similar to each other. If they say, hey, if they ate that, then I can eat this, or basically that they're the same. So eating this Kitnios might convince somebody else, or somehow confuse someone else into thinking they could eat chametz itself. And the third reason is that because of the way Kitnios grows or processed, it's possible there are chametz grains mixed into it, like wheat or barley would be mixed into it, something like that. So according to this reason, the reason for the minhag is if I'm eating Kitnios, I might by mistake actually be eating chametz. So it's not for somebody else; it's sort of for myself. Okay. Anyhow, so these are the 3 reasons given for why this minhag developed. At the beginning, when the minhag first started, there were many who objected to it, who thought it was incorrect, and it goes against the Gemara, etc., etc. But by now, it's become very accepted. It's part of Pesach for everybody who's Ashkenazi. Does not eat Kitnios. So we're going to talk about a bunch of different things. The first thing we have to understand is which foods are Kitnios. So in the Practicum, it speaks about rice, beans, peas, lentils, buckwheat, millet, sesame seeds, and mustard. All of those foods are included in the minhag. And it's also assumed that chickpeas and corn, green beans, poppy seeds, snow peas, soybeans, sugar snap peas, and sunflower seeds are also included in this minhag. We're going to talk about corn a little bit in a minute, but all those that I just mentioned are assumed that they are Kitnios. But Pesach specifically mentioned that coffee, garlic, nuts, fruits, and potatoes are not considered to be Kitnios. Okay, so that was some of the foods that are specifically spoken about. In earlier Pesach. Now, Ramosha says that peanuts technically are not Kitnios. They don't fit into the rules of what should be considered Kitnios, but he says that some people have a minhag to avoid them on Pesach anyhow. And so for a long time, there was this real interesting dichotomy where there were reputable Hashgachahs who wouldn't allow peanuts into anything that they certified for Pesach, and that's because there were many people who did not want to eat peanuts on Pesach, but they would. At the same time, these Hashgachahs would certify peanut oil for Pesach, figuring anybody who's buying peanut oil knows exactly what he's getting. He's getting peanuts, and if you have a custom to not eat peanuts, you would know not to use this. So there was this in between, like you couldn't get potato chips made with peanut oil because that would be like misleading for the people who didn't want to eat peanuts. But at the same time, you could buy peanut oil that did have Hashgachah for Pesach. But that was, so to speak, in the olden days. That was some time ago. Nowadays, most American Jews will not eat peanuts on Pesach, and the mainstream Hashgachahs would not certify things with peanuts, including peanut oil, as kosher Pesach. So that's an interesting food. Okay, we're gonna mention some other examples of foods as we continue on. Now, Ramosha says another thing. He says that the minhag not to eat Kitnios is different than many other minhagim, and he says the only things that are usur that are included in the minhag are things that were around at that time and specifically included to be part of the minhag. So he says that's why potatoes are not Kitnios. Potatoes have a lot of similarities to the other Kitnios and a lot of similarities to grains and should have been included based on the reasons that were given for Kitnios or usur, but they're mutter anyhow. And the reason is because the minhag of Kitnios goes way back, at least until the 1400s, to the times of the Maril, who mentioned such a minhag. So when the minhag is starting way back in the 1400s, there were no potatoes, so to speak, because potatoes didn't come to Europe until the 1500s. So it was a sort of a new vegetable, and that came around after the minhag started, and therefore it was not included in this minhag. So whatever was around and is usur, but the things that were not around are not included. That's what Moshe says. Now, an exception to that rule is corn, or what in other parts of the world are called maize, corn, which the Mishnah Berurah says is Kitnios. Okay, and that's very well accepted, even though corn also wasn't brought to Europe until well after the minhag was established. Now, I'll mention that there are Israeli poskim who don't agree with this ruling of Ramosha, and they would say is even if something is new, it could still be included in the minhag anyhow. And actually, they use corn as their proof. They say, look, everybody knows that corn is Kitnios. Corn is also a new item. So if corn can be included, then other new things could be included as well. So this reason that Moshe gives of that new things are not included in the minhag is the reason why American Hashgachas allow for the use of quinoa on Pesach. Quinoa grows, or originally grew only in South America, in places far away from where the minhag was established. In recent decades, it's become introduced to people who live in the northern hemisphere, and where the Jews are, and or where most of the Yidden are, and therefore, since it was not considered Kitnios beforehand, I mean, the Ashkenazim, when the minhag started, had never even seen quinoa, never knew anything about it. So therefore, according to Moshe, it would therefore be mutter. And of course, those who don't hold like Moshe would hold that you would not be allowed to eat quinoa on Pesach. Now, this svara to permit quinoa is very good. It's very straightforward. It's just worth noting that quinoa is a small little grain, and it's sometimes transported and packaged in the same factories or the same equipment that would be used for packaging wheat and barley, which are also small grain. Those are actually a little bit bigger than quinoa is, but it's relatively small grains. So it's possible, and it has happened, that some of those grains will end up mixed into the quinoa. So therefore, we recommend that people only get quinoa that's specially certified kosher Pesach. So it's interesting. We would technically not include it in the minhag of Kitnios, and therefore it's okay. But one of the reasons that I mentioned beforehand, that there might be grains mixed into it, in fact, does apply. So we use the same caution that's been advised by the minhag, even if we don't technically answer it. Now, one last issue to talk about relating to which foods are Kitnios, and that is the general rule is that spices are inherently not included in the minhag, and the Ramah specifically says that anise, otherwise known as dill, and coriander are not Kitnios. So because they're spices, and those specifically, he makes a point of mentioning those specific spices. But the Taz says, it might not be Kitnios, but Lamaisa, sort of like we just said about quinoa, there is a real possibility of grains being mixed into them just for the way they grow and how they're harvested. So he specifically says that anise and coriander seeds should be checked carefully to make sure that there's no other grains mixed into them. Further, the Taz and the Magen Avram talk about whether it's possible if it's even possible to check and use fennel, cumin, and caraway for Pesach. So again, all of these things, they're all spices, and spices are inherently not Kitnios, but there might be again this concern that there's chametz grains that would become chametz mixed into them, and therefore these poskim talk about whether, if, and how you can use them. And Hashgachas nowadays take different positions about those specific spices, the anise and cumin and things like that. Some allow them, some of them won't allow it no matter what, and some of them are sort of in the middle that they'll allow it if you do, like what the Taz and Magen Avram discuss, you do a really good cleaning or a specialized cleaning or checking to make sure, or sorting to make sure there's no chametz mixed into them. Okay, and one related thing is that there's a question about whether fenugreek is Kitnios. Anyhow, we will get back to where at the end of today's discussion, back to where fenugreek comes up, a particular case where it comes up. Okay, now moving on. Now we've sort of figured out which foods are Kitnios and which ones are not. There's a discussion about what about the derivatives of Kitnios, not the Kitnios itself, but just something that comes from it. So the Ramaz and others are very clear that oil made from Kitnios is asur on Pesach. There are some later poskim who want to argue and say that the derivatives, the oils of Kitnios, are permitted. They're not included in the minhag. Some of the reasons of the original minhag don't apply to the oil; they only apply to the grain itself. Now, as a rule, most poskim, contemporary poskim, are machmer on that and would consider to be oil of Kitnios to be as asur as the Kitnios is. But sometimes a shiloh will come up, and the fact that it's only an oil of a Kitnios will be a reason as a tziruf, a reason to include, among others, to be lenient in a specific case. It comes up at sometimes. Now, so now that we know that oils of Kitnios are not allowed on Pesach, so that means that you can't use corn oil, peanut, rice oil, soybean oil, otherwise known as vegetable oil, all those come from foods that are Kitnios, so we can't use them. But the oils that we can use are olive oil, palm oil, coconuts, walnut oil, avocado oil. Those are all fine because they come from fruits that are not, the fruits themselves are not Kitnios, so then, of course, obviously the oil is also not Kitnios. Now, in Minchas Yitzchak has several chuvas about, two chuvas at least, about, maybe more, I don't remember, at least two chuvas about cottonseed oil. First, he wants to say that it is Kitnios, then he's not so sure, maybe it's not Kitnios, and what sort of happened is that in the United States, cottonseed oil is considered to be, is not treated as Kitnios. In Eretz Yisrael, there are those who will not eat it. So it's a dichotomy, I'll use that word again, difference of approach between the United States and Eretz Yisrael about whether cottonseed oil is Kitnios. As I mentioned before, there's also questions about whether certain other foods I mentioned, quinoa, there are other foods, several other foods like that, where there's a difference of opinion about whether it's Kitnios or not. Now, moving to another oil, canola oil is only became approved to use in the United States in the 1980s. And some people want to say, well, it must be a new thing. If it's a new thing, Moshe said, I told you before, and Moshe says that new items are not included in the minhag if they weren't around from the beginning. That's not it's understandable why someone would say that, but the mistake with that is that canola oil is not really a new oil. Canola oil is really a name given for a specific variety of an oil called rapeseed oil or colza oil. That oil has been used for hundreds of years in Europe for cooking. It was used as an oil that people used. And canola oil is just a type of rapeseed oil that's been bred to have less uricic acid. Uricic acid is a suspect of causing heart disease. So in the United States, regular rapeseed oil is not permitted for food use. And only the canola version of that kind of oil is allowed. So basically, it's not really a new oil at all. In fact, if you look in the Avnei Nezer and the Marsham, actually say that rapeseed and the oil that's made from it that's part of that when they're talking about whether oils are usher or mutter, they're working with an assumption that rapeseed is usher, is considered Kitnios. Relative to that, it's worth noting also that canola, for whatever reason, grows near oats. So even if you think that canola oil is not Kitnios, or you're a Sephardi and you don't care about Kitnios, you should know that you have to make sure that there's no oats as mixed in. The oats have to be sort of taken out before that would be okay to use for Pesach. Now, another thing in the question of derivatives is that scientists have all kinds of ways to use microorganisms to create and to convert all types of foods and enzymes into all kinds of new things that didn't exist an hour ago. So what happens if you take, like for example, what happens if you take corn? Corn has a relatively bland taste to it, and you take an enzyme and you sweeten it to make it into corn syrup. Okay, is that corn syrup also? Corn was Kitnios. Is corn syrup also Kitnios? Is that considered a derivative of Kitnios? What is it? What happens if you take corn syrup, which is sweet, and then you use an enzyme to turn it into ascorbic acid, which is sour, and it's a sour taste to it? Does that make a difference? Now that you changed it, you didn't just make it from bland to sweet, you made it from sweet to sour and to a whole different type of a food. So a lot of these questions depend on Machlokes Rishonim, which Mishmur brings in of all places. It's the middle of Hilchos Brachos, talking about the question of an item called musk. Over there in Hilchos Brachos, it's there to talk about what bracha you make when you smell when you smell it, because this musk, it has a very certain kind of a flavor, a certain odor to it. In fact, it's used a lot in perfumes, and it was assumed to come. It's found in the gland of a certain kind of a deer, a musk deer. It's called, of the male musk deer, and it's the deer is kosher, but it's assumed that it comes from blood. Now, blood, of course, is not kosher. So some Rishonim say, well, if blood turns into musk, then since blood is not kosher, then musk is also not kosher. Others say that no, once the blood is nishtana, it changed from blood into musk. I mean, it's pretty dramatic. It went from being blood into this thing that can be used as a fragrant item in perfume. That's a pretty dramatic change. Then that's dramatic enough. That's considered nishtana. and therefore now that it's nishtana, it becomes innocuous. It becomes like something brand new, and then brand new thing is not blood. So the Mishnah Berurah says that what you should do is, as relates to deraises, you should be machmir, but for the rabbanos you can be mekel. Well, so now switching back to our Kitnios, some Hashgachah say, well, Kitnios is just a minhag. Minhag is much less stringent even than in the rabbanon. So if Mishnah Berurah says we can be mekel about nishtana by the rabbanons, then for sure you can be mekel about nishtana when we have Kitnios, which was nishtana. So that means if the Kitnios went through a really significant change, then we say it's nishtana, and therefore since nishtana it's like a new thing and it's not included in the minhag. So for example, in the case I gave you beforehand, these hashgachas would say is you could give hashgacha to the ascorbic acid because it went from sweet to sour, but not for the corn syrup, because to go from corn, which is a little sweet or relatively bland, to a little sweeter, that's not enough of a dramatic change. Okay, so based on those who take the lenient position, those who do that would therefore give hashgacha to certain things, to certain types of aspartame, citric acid, MSG, or xanthan gum made from Kitnios. The thinking being that if it went through a very dramatic change, then it could be even though it started off as Kitnios, the finished product is not also on Pesach. Now others don't agree with this. Some say the Mishnah Berurah who said this is only talking about b'di'evet. If you something goes nishtana and now you have the finished product, okay, now you could eat it, or now it's mutter for Pesach, we would say. But that doesn't mean going ahead and making it lechatchila, choosing to make it and then certifying it as kosher Pesach. That's not what the Mishnah Berurah had in mind. This machlokes rishonim is for things that were already made, not to go ahead and actively give hashgacha to it. Other people say is, well, it doesn't even qualify as nishtana, because in order to be nishtana, and it has to become inedible at some point in the middle of that changeover from Isser to this new thing, and that doesn't necessarily happen in this case over here. Okay, so that's a machlokes about nishtana. Again, in Eretz Yisrael, there are those who are machmir. Even in America, there are those who are makbid on this, who will not eat kitnios and nishtana. And at the same time, there are other hashgachas that will allow it, as I mentioned, because the reason they say this kitnios and nishtana is not us anymore. It's worth noting, we're going to talk in a minute about halachos that relate to Kitnios. It's worth noting that even if you say it's usher, when that ingredient is used in a food, transports into another food, it often won't make a difference to the kashrus or the other food for Pesach. But we'll get to that in a second. Now, let's talk about some halachos about Kitnios. The minhag is to not eat it, and the minhag starts from the same time on Erev Pesach when you can't eat chametz. That's whatever time, a certain time in the morning, you can't eat chametz. At that same time, you also can't eat kitnios as well. Now, even though the minhag is you can't eat kitnios, not on Pesach or even from Erev Pesach on certain times, at certain part of the day, you're allowed to own it and you can have benefit from it. So therefore, you can keep, if you have a can of sweet corn in your pantry, you can keep it over Pesach. It's kitnios, so you can't eat it, but you're allowed to keep it. And you can also, if you want to feed your parrot and you want to give it millet is kitnios, and that's fine. You can have hana from it. You can benefit from it by feeding it to your animal. Another thing is, the minhag is only for your everyday people, people who are children or people who are ill, or people who have very restricted diets, are allowed to eat kitnios. And so that a person who thinks that they, so to speak, qualify to be allowed to eat kitnios for one of those reasons needs to speak it over with their rav just to make sure that they, in fact, to judge in fact that they should be allowed to eat kitnios. Now, this idea that children and people who are ill are allowed to eat kitnios is very relevant to when discussing baby formula and nutritional supplements like Ensure, because these things, almost always have kitnios in it. They're like made out of corn syrup and things like that, soy. And they are used by people who basically don't have much choice but to eat kitnios. So they're allowed to eat it. Okay, so if they're eating it, it's not Pesach, so you shouldn't prepare it in the Pesach dishes. You have to use dishes. You have to wash the equipment, the containers or the dishes out in a place where it's not Pesach and it's not chametz either. Those people shouldn't be eating chametz, so you need to find some way to wash them and to use dishes that are special for these people. It's also worth remembering that these people who are allowed to eat Kitnios, they're only allowed to eat Kitnios. They're not allowed to eat chametz. So when we choose a supplement for one of those people, it's not going to be certified for Pesach because it's Kitnios. So it won't be say Kashrus Pesach on it. So they're going to have to make sure that they have to figure out how they're going to figure out that it's Kitnios only and it's not chametz in it. Like some of them may have oats in them, or I don't know, barley malt extract in there. Who knows what it could have in it that could possibly be chametz. So to help consumers, navigate this, every year the OU, which is the one who certifies most of these products year round, works through to decide to make a list of which items are in fact just Kitnios, and they're allowed to be used by people who are sick, or for children, or things like certain kinds of people like that. They make a list of it. We reprint that list in our Pesach guide as well. It's on our website, but it really comes from the OU, and of course they have it in their publications. Now, let's pause for a second while we're talking about people who are allowed to eat Kitnios, but who have to make sure they don't eat chametz. There's another group of people who are like that, and that's the Sephardim, because Sephardim don't have this minhag to avoid Kitnios. So, for example, they eat rice. Rice is like a staple food for the Sephardim on Pesach. But even though they eat rice, they have to make sure there's no chametz in it. So many Sephardim, in fact, their custom is that they check the rice carefully before they eat it to make sure there's no other grains mixed into it. Actually, sort of relevant to that is that a lot of rice, most rice in the United States is enriched. And there are different opinions whether Sephardim could eat that rice, or should they be concerned that the enrichment, the vitamins that it's enriched with, are possibly chametz. Put that on side for a second. Now, but these Sephardim, so they make efforts to make sure they're only eating Kitnios. So in recent years, they've started working with the national Hashgachahs to figure out, okay, which foods are only Kitnios that you can't certify for Pesach, or maybe you'll certify it for which you wouldn't certify as Kashrus Pesach, but we could eat it anyhow. Like maybe they want to have a vegetable oil. Vegetable oil, again, wouldn't be certified for Pesach because it's made from Kitnios. Corn oil or soy oil is made from Kitnios. But the Sephardi wants to make sure there's no chametz in it. So Hashgachahs have started helping them to try to figure out which things are actually chametz free that they should be allowed to eat it. Okay. Now, back to halachos. Back to halachos of Kitnios. Kitnios is batal b'roiv, which means that if somebody mistakenly put Kitnios into their food on Pesach, the food is mutter b'diavad, assuming, of course, that there's more of other ingredients more than the Kitnios is. It may taste have a strong taste of Kitnios to it, but even so, it's mutter. Unless, of course, you see pieces floating around. If some corn fell into your soup, you just scoop the corn out. But if it's mixed in, or the just a tam of it, then it would be okay, assuming it's batal b'roiv. So back to we talked about Kitnios shenishtana. If we have a beverage, let's say Diet Pepsi or Diet Coke, and it's sweetened with aspartame made from Kitnios shenishtana, so the Kitnios is not more than half the drink, and therefore, even if you hold that Kitnios shenishtana, that you are not willing to permit Kitnios shenishtana per se, but in the drink it's going to be okay, because in the drink it's going to be batal b'roiv. Also, similarly, I mentioned way back when I mentioned that there's a question whether fenugreek is Kitnios or not. Even those who are machmir to not eat fenugreek would allow it in maple syrup. It's, for some reason, it's a common flavoring used in maple syrup, because again, it'll always be batal b'roiv. So that means to say is that a lot of the disagreements we talk about whether certain foods are Kitnios or they're not Kitnios is relevant for the person who wants to use the food as is. Like, do I want to use quinoa? Do I not want to use quinoa? Or something like that. Do I want to use put MSG right into my food if it's Kitnios shenishtana? Or do you want to give Hashgachah to a company like that? But once it's already mixed into a food, as a rule, it'll be batal b'roiv, and you'll be allowed to eat the food anyhow. Okay, so I want to end off by mentioning that aside from the minhag of Kitnios, the Ramah in Taf Samach Zayin, brings all kinds of other minhagim people had about Pesach. People didn't eat honey, raisins, dried fruit, sugar, saffron, cloves, and Pesach can bring all kinds of other things that people in different communities avoided on Pesach. Now, those minhagim, many of them are very different than Kitnios. Kitnios is also no matter what, as opposed to many of those other minhagim are only because there was a concern that the item might have chametz mixed into it. And if you come to a place where there's no such concern, if you don't have that issue that there might be chametz mixed into it, then a lot of people do not follow those customs anymore because they live in places where the concern doesn't play out anymore. Therefore, it's not an issue. Not like Kitnios, where even if the concern doesn't apply, it's also anyhow. But of course, when a person has a question about that, is this my family minhag, and we shouldn't eat dried fruit, or is it okay because nowadays there isn't such a concern, or there is a concern, they should find out. So people should speak to the rabbi to find out the best practice that they should do.